Good evening, and you're all very welcome to this evening's webinar, which is being brought to you tonight by the Teagasc advisory staff here in County Mayo. My name is Brendan Gary. I work in Teagasc and Ballina, and tonight, for the next hour, I'm delighted to be your host for this webinar. Now, this evening's webinar is the second episode in a new series of webinars which will run throughout the month of January and for 3 weeks in February, each Tuesday night at 8 p.m. The same link will work for each episode. Now, during the series, we will cover some of the key agricultural issues facing Irish farmers in 2024. Tonight, however, our focus switches to the theme of sheep husbandry. And with us tonight is Damian Costello, Sheep Specialist from Athenry. And Damian is going to talk to us about some winter flock management tips and things to watch out for over the next few weeks. While later this evening, my colleague John Walsh from Teagasc Ballina will join us and will share some tips and tricks to ensure a smooth lambing season. Now, you, the viewers at home this evening, are being encouraged to engage with our speakers here tonight, and we encourage you to type your questions into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens, phones or tablets. And later this evening, Vivian Selch, the Teagasc Regional Manager here in County Mayo, will put your questions live to our panellists. So please type your questions into the Q&A box. As always, this webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch back in the coming days on our Teagasc Mayo YouTube channel. So indeed, you can check out all our videos and previous webinars there as well. So without further delay, I'll now ask you, Damian, to start sharing your presentation with us. And it's over to you now, Damian.
Thanks for that, Brendan. And good evening, everybody. Let's just get this. Okay. What Brendan asked me to cover this evening was some of the practical issues around the housing of sheep. Secondly, then keeping an eye, a close eye on the body condition of yours. And finally, then a few tips maybe on good feeding management. I suppose nobody needs any reminding of 2023 was a year to forget, I suppose, for a lot of farmers. I was just looking at figures recently there from the weather recording in Athenry in July. There was 254% of the normal rainfall for July. It was 120% or something for August. So the result of this, I suppose, that we were dealing with grass that was a very low dry matter. You're talking about 12 or 13%. The knock-on effect from this, I suppose, was that we had particularly poor lamb thrive, and I think most farmers will agree that lamb thrive was pretty challenging, particularly in the second half of 2023. In turn, I suppose, what a lot of people found was that ewes were turning up at turnout to the ram in probably lesser condition than normal in a lot of cases. And then as the year went on, I suppose grass supply again, due to low dry matter, it was disappearing fast on many farms as the year went on. And added to this, then with the ground conditions was leading to very poor utilisation. So they weren't utilising the grass that was there, so it was being walked into the ground really. So a very challenging year, it's fair to say. I suppose moving on then, in terms of the sheep housing, and I know that there'll be people on here tonight where they're not housing their sheep, or they have a system for outwintering. But for those, I suppose, that are housing, some of the key issues that we come across, I suppose, in terms of housing, or housing that's not very efficient, is things like pens being overcrowded, and where you have this, it's very difficult to keep the bedding clean in straw-bedded sheds. You can get bullying then, where ewes that are a bit timid or a bit shy are not getting a fair crack at the feed, and they're being bullied. And you'll often find that where you have thin ewes in groups like this, it's thinner they get because they're just not they're not competing, we'll say, for feed. And then when we look at feed space again, similar issues, I suppose. If ewes are not willing to compete for feed, if feed space is limited, they're going to suffer. And again, if they're in poor body condition, it's only worse they'll get in a situation like that. And again, the knock-on effect from this is that you can encounter issues such as metabolic diseases, such as um, milk fever and twin lamb disease. And also, we've often found more issues with prolapse in sheds where pen space is limited, or feed space, I should say. Sorry. Other issues, I suppose, we find if you've got a poorly ventilated shed, it creates a damp atmosphere in the building. And again, you'll find it more difficult to keep straw under them in straw bedded situations. And it's no big secret, I suppose, that straw is particularly scarce commodity this year, difficult to source, and very, very expensive as well. The other issue, I suppose, with poor ventilation is, I suppose, airborne disease, and that there can be associated health issues with poorly ventilated buildings. Other things, I suppose, or other challenges you find is, not providing a constant access to forage. They should have a relatively constant access to forage. Try not to be letting them completely run out of whatever forage you're feeding. Water trucks not cleaned out often enough. Again, having clean water is really important, particularly in late pregnancy where ewes are on maybe fairly high levels of concentrates. Having the trucks there is one thing, but you should be checking them to make sure that they're not soiled, or cleaning them out every so often. Lots of people, I suppose, in the West End have slatted accommodation for sheep. And again, keeping the slatted areas clean can be a challenge with some. Again, it's important that you'd regularly clean out the material that's pulled into the slats. If you do that on a fairly regular basis, it seems to be the best solution. I know it's an extra job and everything like that, but it is important that you start to try and sweep up the bit of pulled in material before it gets to a stage where it's clogging the slats. And again, important to check floor space, and we'll talk a little bit about the department floor space requirements there in a second. So, as I said, the Department of Agriculture have they have guidelines in terms of what the allocation, I suppose, for slatted and straw bedded sheds in terms of the minimum requirement in terms of floor space. And look, as I say, these are minimum requirements. It's no harm at all to have a little bit extra on that. There is probably a good number of people maybe have joined the organic farming scheme in the last year or so, and again the requirements are slightly higher. Again, I think it's 1.5 meters squared is the minimum requirement for straw bedded sheds for the organic people. But we are talking about large framed lowland ewes. You're talking about 1.2 square meters of a floor space required per ewe on slats, and 1.4 meters squared in a straw bedded situation, and down from there. I suppose we often get asked the question then, for people, particularly maybe people that are lambing a little bit earlier, if they're housing ewes with lambs at foot, what are the space requirements? For a ewe that's rearing a single lamb, you add on 30% to the above figures in order to calculate the space requirement. And a ewe then is rearing twin lambs, it's 60% more floor space required than above. For those that practice winter shearing, where you'd be shearing the ewes at housing or shortly after housing, you can get away with 15 to 20% less floor space with shorn ewes, just simply because they're not quite as bulky. But again, as I say, in a straw bedded situation, a little bit over the required area sometimes can be an advantage. I mentioned already as well then about feed space requirements, and again, really important to have the required feed space. And you're looking that all ewes can eat meal comfortably together at one time. sometimes when you're starting to feed, 6 or 8 weeks out from lambing, starting to feed your supplementary concentrates, it can appear that ewes have lots of space, but particularly ewes that are carrying twins or even triplets, it's really bulkier they will get from there on. So it's a useful exercise to do for anybody that's housing sheep to actually physically measure the area or the feed space on each pen, just to see how you're fixed. And again, it's 600 millimeters or 2 feet for large framed ewes. So I mean, if you think of your standard 4.8 meter bay, if you have very large framed ewes, you're talking about maybe eight ewes, 9 ewes is the minimum, is the maximum ewes that will feed at the front of the barrier. It's not a great photograph I have there down at the bottom right hand corner, but again, a lot of people, in order to increase, I suppose, the feed space available, use walk-through tracks, particularly if the design of the shed is with larger, deeper pens. It's important, I suppose, when you're measuring the likes of a feeding system there, where you're feeding on two sides of a pen, that you allow for the corners, because if you've ewes feeding across the front of the barrier there, they will blank off the first space or two on the walk-through track. So normally what we say is to take off 600 millimeters per corner when you're calculating that. But it is a useful exercise to do. Some people ask as well, I've mentioned it there, if you're feeding outdoors in tracks, you're talking about 300 to 500 millimeters of track space per ewe. That's assuming that they can feed from both sides of the track, which they can in most cases. So again, it is important that each sheep is getting a fair crack at the feed. And again, as I mentioned earlier on, it's often situations that the feed space is compromised. The weaker sheep in the pen are not getting adequate nutrition. You're putting out the right amount, but they're just not all getting fair access to it. Again, from a silage point of view, it's less feed space that's required from a roughage or a hay or a silage feed. However, it is important that there's a constant supply kept there, that you have constant access to it. Just a word then, I suppose, on the management at housing. There with the grass supply, I suppose, and so on, disappearing quick, and the weather conditions, maybe certain situations, particularly on heavier stock farms, they may have been housing a little bit earlier than they normally would have been. But nonetheless, there's still a lot of farms, March lambing ewes, where they're housing in or around now. They're probably scanning the ewes during the month of January, and maybe oftentimes they're maybe housing afterwards. Again, as we always say, it's important that the shed is prepared well in advance. It's cleaned and given a chance to dry out well before housing. If at all possible, and it has been possible maybe over the last couple of weeks, but if at all possible, it's important to avoid housing sheep with wet fleeces. They will take a long time to dry out inside. And again, going back to the airborne, it's creating that damp atmosphere in the shed, and there is risks of pneumonia and different things like that. So if at all possible, have the sheep reasonably fairly dry at housing. Again, from a foot point of view, it's important not to house lame sheep, because you have an environment that is really conducive to the spread of the likes of bush rot or these confined area. So if you have lame sheep at housing, they should be separated out. Treat them appropriately. Talk to your vet if needs be in terms of antibiotic treatment for the likes of bush rot or cod or any of these types of things, and wait until the infection is fully cleared up before housing. If this isn't possible, I suppose at a minimum, if you had a pen where you would put the lame sheep all together, at least they're not spreading it to sheep with healthy hooves in the flock. Again, if you have the proper facilities, it's good practice to footbath all ewes before housing as a preventative method. And again, if you have the ewes out during the housing period for, say, their clostridial vaccine, I think John will talk a little bit more about that later. it's no harm to put them through the footbath. People worry about treating them, putting them through a footbath too close to lambing. If the facilities are right and you handle them with due care, there's no big issue with it. Again, I mentioned scanning. There's a lot of March lambing flocks being scanned around now. Again, when you're penning the ewes, obviously scanning is one thing, but using the results is really important as well. So you're grouping them according to their scanned litter size, so that you can feed them accordingly. In cases where you've been particularly good in terms of rattle colours and changing and that, it's also a very accurate predictor of lambing date. So if you want to pen the later lambing ewes together so that you won't be starting to feed them too early. And the other thing, I suppose, that, and I'll talk about in a second, the other really important thing to take into account, particularly this year, is the body condition of ewes. So it might be appropriate, for example, if you have a group of triplet-bearing ewes after scanning, if you went through the twin-bearing ewes and found that there was a number of them that were thin or a bit behind in body condition, that you would put them in with the triplets or put them on the same feeding regime. Again, I mentioned earlier about the straw, but it is important that you're keeping the environment fairly clean and dry. And again, people often use the likes of lime along the feed barriers, and it keeps that area reasonably dry, and can be a help in terms of foot problems as well. I mentioned there about body condition score, and we won't get too hung up on the scoring. The body condition scoring is done on a scale of 1 to 5. The target is to have a minimum of around 3 at lambing time, 3 to 3.5. But I suppose the key to it really is managing them. If you have a number of thinner ewes that you still have time to act. If you have ewes lambing down in poor body condition, they'll really suffer in early lactation, because the energy demand of the ewe goes up hugely after lambing in terms of producing milk to rear her lambs. So they need that body condition to be able to milk off their back, as they say. So they just, if you have a lot of ewes lambing down in very poor condition, they will struggle for milk supply. And again, there's no quick fix way of checking the body condition other than leaving your hand on their back. And there's just a note there of what does body condition score of 3 feel like. That when you feel along the spine, it's fairly smooth and round. You don't have the spinous process protruding up, and the eye muscle is fairly full, and the transverse process is rounded. So that they're handling fairly well. So it is important. Again, as I say, it's not too late. It's important maybe to, even as I say, leaving aside the whole area of whether they're a body condition 3 or 3.5. If you can pick out what's thin, what's fit, and what's fat, you've done a good job. And again, focus the attention on the under-conditioned ewes within the flock. As I say, overfat ewes, sometimes people have a big concern about them, but in most cases it's harder to find, and provided they're managed reasonably well, they're less problems, generally speaking, they're less problems than under-conditioned ewes. So a lot of cases we're still 6 to 8 weeks out from lambing, so you could separate out the poor conditioned ewes at scanning. And as I say, starting with a little bit extra concentrate feeding and starting in time, it's much easier to maintain them in the body condition they are pre-lambing than post-lambing. As I say, if they're very poor condition at lambing, you could be in bother. Again, we're often asked, I suppose, in terms of the type of feed or the quality of feed. And again, it is important to feed a good quality nut or ration. In most cases, people are buying in a ready-made nut or ration, and it's balanced with minerals and so on. This is just sort of a traffic light system, if you like, on where you would look. Generally speaking, ration labels, have a look at the label, and the ingredients are listed by inclusion rate in descending order. So whatever is listed first has the highest inclusion rate. You won't get an actual percentage for each of the ingredients, but ideally, the first two, three, four ingredients, you'd like to see them coming from the green list, or the higher quality energy sources, because that will make up the majority of the ration. You certainly don't want to see the low energy ones on the red bar there appearing in the top few, because it's a sign that it's an inferior quality feed. And again, soya bean meal is still the Rolls Royce in terms of a protein source for late pregnancy feeding of ewes. So you'd like to see that in the top 2 or 3 ingredients. So if you have your cereals and your pulps and your soya bean and those type of things in the first few on the list, you're fairly happy that it's a good quality ration. Again, this is just a quick example, and I'm conscious of time because I'll be handing over to John there in a minute, but this is just an example, I suppose, for twin-bearing ewes, a sample sort of feeding plan for different feed value silages. So it is important to check to get a sample and get an analysis done on the silage you're feeding. It makes for far more accurate feeding, and there is savings to be made in terms of concentrates. Again, I've down at the bottom there, it's for ewes in good body condition. That's important. You need to adjust. If you have ewes in poor body condition, you need to be feeding them a little bit extra. But I just have a sort of maybe an example there of a 70 DMD silage. For ewes that are in good body condition, 70 DMD bale silage, and this is just an idea for a sample, suppose, feeding plan for ewes that are carrying singles, twins, and triplets. As you can see, you can delay starting feeding the singles until maybe 4 or 5 weeks out from lambing, and maybe starting 7 or 8 weeks out then with the twins and the triplets. This is, again, as I say, based on 70 DMD silage. And ensuring, again, as we mentioned, that you're fairly good quality feed, and that 90 to 20% crude protein with soya bean is the main protein source. And, as we mentioned earlier on, grouping according to litter size and so on, and adjusting for lesser body condition ewes. And again, good feeding management is really important in all of this. And just a few notes then, I suppose, on the feeding management. I've mentioned a few times already the importance of having constant access to roughage. You're not allowing them to run out of it. It's important to, ewes are picky eaters. They will sort through it, and they will leave behind less palatable and less digestible stuff. Ideally, you should be taking this away at least once a week, and ideally maybe twice a week if you could. You're effectively upping the quality of feed you're feeding to your ewes, because, as I say, they're leaving behind the less digestible material, and it is good to remove that on a regular basis. Mentioning supplementing with concentrates, important to reduce it in time and build it up gradually, as per the example we showed on the last slide. From once your feed gets over a half a kilo, you should be feeding it twice daily, split into 2 feeds, morning and evening. Good to keep the feeding times fairly consistent, at least 8 hours apart. Make sure they have a good clean water supply, and that involves checking the drinkers regularly. Keep an eye out for shy feeders as well. They will need to be taken out and put in a pen of their own, because if they're standing back at the feed face, they're obviously not getting the thing. They're not getting the fair crack at it. So the other point I just make, and be fully aware that there are people maybe that, such as I mentioned at the start, they possibly outwinter their ewes and maybe just house them for a short time at just before lambing. it's important here to avoid kind of sudden changes in diet. If you're housing just before lambing and they're going to be on hair, silage, and a bit of concentrates, have them on that diet, that diet outdoors for a period before they're housed. So it's kind of a more gradual changeover to the housing system. So avoiding any sudden changes. Brendan, I leave it at that. Just a couple of points in summary before I hand over to John. Making sure that your sheds are working properly and they're efficient. Check the floor space and the feed space, and maybe put a plan in place for any modifications. And even for the feed space, a simple modification can be sort of a hang-on trough on one side of the pen or something that will just allow that extra 2 or 3 ewes to feed there. Keep a close eye on the condition of ewes, and act in time, start in time to take action. And as I mentioned just in the last slide there, keep getting the simple things right in terms of feeding management is key as well. So I leave it at that.
That's great, Damian. Thank you very
I'll
much.
stop sharing, and sure. I don't know. Is it at the end you want to take the questions or that?
Yeah, we'll take the questions at the end after John. Yeah. So thanks very much, Damien, for that. And indeed, just a reminder again to our viewers at home this evening, just to keep sending in your questions, and we'll pick them up after John's presentation. So now at this stage of the evening, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, which is John Walsh from Teagasc Ballina, and it's over to you now, John. That's perfect now, John. Thanks very much.
Yeah, no problem at all. Okay, so yeah, as Brendan said there, I'm John Walsh. I'm in Teagasc Ballina, and I'm a dry stock advisor there. So I'm going to be going through a bit more in detail on trying to reduce lamb mortality when it comes to actually lambing down the ewes. So I suppose it's kind of more following on from what Damien was just saying there earlier, and following on the points that he kind of made. So once the ewes are housed, I suppose, how do we kind of prevent and make sure that all the lambs that we have try and survive as best they can. So if we can at all, what we try and do is minimize lamb mortality. So the easiest way to do that is, get the starting points right, I suppose, like get the nutrition right at the very, very beginning. So as Damien said in the last few slides he had there, having a plan in place to, separate out your singles, your couples, and your triplets, and feed them accordingly from that. The other one then, I suppose, is metabolic disorders from maybe overfeeding or underfeeding. The other one then, I suppose, is hygiene at lambing, making sure you have enough bedding, enough feed space, enough lying space, making sure the shed, I suppose, is clean. And that follows on then and prevents a lot of the disease that can outbreak in the shed. And I think the big one there, often in older sheds, that maybe farmers might, maybe skip on was ventilation in older sheds, where sheds might be low roofs on them, and the bedding really material gets quite soiled quite quickly. So as Damien said, having good ventilation in shed can really reduce your disease outbreaks in the shed. And then as well, genetics, having good genetics, and maybe problem ewes, getting rid of them out of the farm and bringing in, more profitable and maybe less disease into the flock if you can at all. Then breeding good replacements from maybe ewes that you have known good mothering ability on the farm, and keep them that way. And as well, just managing the whole flock as a whole, and having maybe a herd health or a flock health plan at the very beginning. So there's just a study that was done a couple of years ago, and I touch a bit more on it in the next slide, but over half the lambs that don't make it, they generally die in the first 24 hours of life, of their own life. So that's down to a couple of reasons, and I'll touch on them there. But I suppose on a lot of sheep flocks, it's possible to achieve about 10% or less mortality to weaning. So if you've 100 lambs on your farm, you try not to lose, less than 10 of them on the farm. So there was a study done by Dwayne Shields as part of his PhD in Athenry back, I suppose, in 2018 there, where he looked at over 200 lambs and over a couple of years of how or what was the reasons that were causing them to die, I suppose, after the first couple of hours after birth and the first couple of days after birth. So the main one there, and the main cause of lamb mortality, was actually infections. That was the main cause that really, caused all these lambs to die. The other ones, I suppose, there were accidental deaths congenital defects. There was quite a lot of hard lamins there, 15%. But I suppose the big take-home message from his study was a lot of these are preventable by closer attention. So the big ones there, and I suppose that's where I'm going to focus on this presentation is the big ones are hygiene. So it's essential to reduce infections, get enough colostrum into the lambs early on in their life. So making sure your ewes have adequate colostrum, and that goes back to what Damian said, feeding the ewes adequately before they lamb, and ensuring all lambs get enough colostrum in those first few hours before they're born or when they're born. And then dystocia, which goes back to again what Damian said, having correct body condition score and making sure the nutrition is right to ensure that you have good quality lambs when they're born down, not too light or not over heavy lambs when they're born either. So I suppose the big thing about lambing is, I suppose, being prepared before your start lambing. And there's no point really having a couple of ewes lambed and then saying, geez, I better run to town, get a few bits for the lambing shed. It's good practice, I suppose, to have a list ready and get going before you start. If you're in the co-op or whatever, just have an idea in your head of what you need for lambing well in advance of what you're going, when you're going to lamb down, because what can often happen is, we'll say, and especially when it comes to March, you could go into the co-op and they could be out of certain thing you need for when you're lambing. So it's good practice to get into to have it in good time. At least then, if it's not in stock, you can get it another day that maybe they'll order it in for you. So I just made a quick list there of stuff that I could think of that is kind of essential. So big one there, I suppose, is gloves, lambing lube, lime, straw, as Damien touched on, was can be hard come by this year, but it is the gold standard when it comes to bedding lambs. And I wouldn't try and skimp on it if I could at all when it came to those individual lambing pens. Trying to keep the hygiene as best we can will prevent a lot of the losses long term. So using straw, and don't be sparing it as such on those individual lambing pens. Having clean buckets, as Damien said as well, having clean water troughs, good quality pins, having lambing ropes, iodine to prevent infections, clean stomach tubes, needles, syringes, having thermometers, milk replacers, all that kind of thing. And I suppose there's another quite a big one I've noticed over the past few years on certain farms is some farmers are buying cull tags to put on ewes when they are lambing, so that we'll say if a ewe only has milk on one side, that they can tag her and say, right, she won't be kept for breeding, because what can often happen is the farmer might say, oh, well, that ewe is only one side and another. Then what can happen there is she'll go off to the field, and when it comes to weaning time in, we'll say late June, she looks like a great ewe and she looks fine for breeding again. So it's often a good practice to get into at lambing time. So if there's any problem ewes, that they get a cull tag and they're gone out of your flock, it just reduces the labour long term for you. So as I said as well, the lambing pens, making sure that they're in a clean environment, having enough straw, having enough lime, and minimizing the risks of harmful bugs in that lambing environment. And again, like I said, having good ventilation in the shed. It keeps, that build up of disease and that damp air inside in lambing pens. Also, like I said, the lambing equipment, making sure you use gloves. And when I say about using gloves, when you have finished lambing a ewe or moving lambs, you should dispose that glove and try and prevent cross-contamination from lamb to lamb. Using plenty of lubricant when handling ewes if it has to be done during lambing. Making sure that you're actually using veterinary lubricant, because sometimes people like to use household, let's say like Fairy Liquid or that, but it often can happen is cause infections in ewes. So it's better to use the veterinary prescribed lubricant when you are handling ewes. Cleaning and disinfecting lambing utensils after use as well is quite important, so that there's no infections being spread across your lambs in the shed. So I suppose the slide on that there on how to sterilize equipment, and this is for farmers, I suppose, as well. They might say, oh, well, it's fine. I'm finding it very hard to sterilize equipment between lamb to lamb because I don't have hot water in the shed. So there's quite a good thing there where you can have a 1, 2, 3 bucket system where you have in the first bucket, you have cold water and washing up liquid. In the second bucket, you have cold water. And in the third bucket, you have cold water and sterilizer like Milton or something like that in it. So what you'll be using that for is to sterilize bottles, teats, stomach tubes, lambing ropes, laminades, etc. You don't need the hot water, and you replace all the contents of the buckets daily and as per label on the sterilising fluid. And the equipment can be left in bucket 3 then until it's needed, and you don't need to rinse after bucket 3. So the idea of that is you suck up the syringe in bucket 1, you rinse it out, then you suck up the syringe in the cold water in bucket 2, and then finally you suck up the one in the bucket 3. So the idea of that is that it's fully sterilised from when you use it to the next lamb or the next yo that lambs down or whatever you might be using. So it's a good way of sterilising your equipment. The next one then is on to feeding the lamb. And like I said, like in that study that Dwayne Shields did, a lot of the lambs were dying because they didn't get enough antibodies into them early on in their life. So the idea is there that making sure enough lambs drink the adequate colostrum early on in life. So with a lamb, they usually need 50 ml per kilo every 6 hours. So we'll just take, for example, a 5 kilo lamb, which is a standard, I suppose, weight of a newborn lamb. That lamb would need 250 ml of milk every 6 hours. So that's about 1 litre they need to get into them in the first 24 hours. And it's making sure each lamb that you see lambing down gets enough yolk colostrum in the first feed. Now, you can see there's a picture of a lamb getting a stomach tube. Now, you don't need to go and stomach tube every lamb. Like, if a lamb has been observed getting enough colostrum into him and standing to suck, then that'd be perfectly fine too. But the idea is to make sure you see the lamb getting adequate colostrum early on and not to have them left too long, because if it's left too long, the antibodies that are in that colostrum drop dramatically over the first couple of hours. So it's vitally important that they get them early on when they're born. Another thing as well is if you have hypothermic lambs or weak lambs, you can get an intraperinatal injection before you put them into a warming box to actually get enough glucose into them to give them nearly like a kickstart in life. So often you'd see this happening maybe in outdoor flocks in England where they use a dextrose solution and they inject the lamb, they hold up the lamb with their hand and they go 1 inch across from the navel and 1 inch down, and they inject at an angle into the lamb's stomach, and then they inject them with the dextrose solution. Now, there is a bit of a skill to it, but if you do give it to them, it gives them that bit of a kick early on in life. And oftentimes you'll see that it will give them a boost if they're very, very hypothermic. But it does take a bit of skill to get that done. Now, the dextrose solution, you can get that from the likes of your chemist or your vet would have that as well. So it does take a bit of skill to get that. Okay. So the other issues, I suppose, around flock health, around lambing that often crop up at that time. So it's the big one that could crop up especially at lambing time is the likes of toxoplasmosis, enzootic abortion, the likes of salmonella outbreaks and listeriosis outbreaks as well. So these can cause abortions in your flock or maybe empty ewes and the likes of toxo. But the enzootic abortion and the toxoplasmosis, they can be vaccinated for, but it is important if you do have an outbreak of it that you know exactly what the outbreak of abortion is, so that we seeking veterinary advice from that to clearly identify what it is. And if there is an outbreak, those ewes should be isolated from the rest of the flock until they're tested to see what is actually causing the abortion on the farm. The other ones then is clostridial diseases like pasteurella pneumonia, pulpy kidney, lamb dysentery. And if you're using the likes of your Heptavac Ps, your Covexin 10s, your Ovipass, you can vaccinate for your clostridial diseases. And like any of the clostridial vaccines or the toxo vaccines, it usually is a two-step approach where you vaccinate, where you give them an injection 1 week, and then maybe 4 to 6 weeks later, you give them another injection as a booster. And then every year after that, they have to get a booster vaccine then. So there's no use really giving them just one injection. It won't give them full immunity to the disease. So you have to give them the two-stage injection first, and then every year after that. So in the case of maybe if you're bringing in your lambs to the flock, you'd vaccinate them 4 weeks apart, and then every year after that, you could vaccinate them. So it's usually 4 to 6 weeks prior to lambing if you're giving them the booster vaccine that you'd give that. Looking at metabolic diseases now. I suppose the big ones, as Damien said, the likes of if there's bullying in a pen, where you could have issues around prolapse or overfeeding, maybe bulky forage. Then you could end up with maybe on thin nose, you might end up with twin lamb disease, milk fever, white muscle, or swayback in lambs as well if they weren't fed appropriately early on prior to lambing. The other ones as well, then, like I said, on the hygiene side of things, joint ill, navel ill, wash your mouth and scours. And often cases, these infections generally happen later on, maybe the third or fourth week of lambing, when we've lost the ewes lambed. You'd generally have joint ill and navel ill and wash your mouth breaking out because I suppose the build up of infection has, gradually built up over the last few weeks. And maybe the hygiene on the farmer side, because naturally enough, a farmer might be tired after the last couple of weeks, and maybe things have slipped a bit on the hygiene side of things. But again, it's all about keeping that hygiene quite well to stop infections. The other ones then are genetic issues like endotropium, where that's where the eyelids are turned back, contracted tendons, and intestinal abnormalities. And if there is any abnormalities like that that you are unsure of, it's quite a good practice if you can at all. I know lambing is quite busy, but if there is something like that on a farm, that those lambs are sent away to the regional veterinary labs, either in Athlone or Sligo, and you can consult with your vet about that if you want to send them off to the regional vet labs. Looking as well, and I know Damien said it from the get-go there, it was a bit of a year to forget, 2023 for sheep farmers with how wet the year was. And I suppose the first thing you'll know if you have sheep in the west of Ireland and you're on maybe wetter ground is liver fluke outbreaks on farms. So the big problem, I suppose, this year, or I suppose last back end, was that I suppose it got wet quite quick in August, and the outbreak liver fluke probably started a bit earlier. And as a result of that, when the department brought out their liver fluke forecast, it was perfect conditions for a liver fluke outbreak on farms. And generally, farms who may have been on drier ground, who never really dosed for liver fluke, ended up this year having to dose for liver fluke. Like if you look at the map of Ireland there on your screens, there's parts of the east of the country where you'd imagine that it'd be seriously dry ground that are having issues with liver fluke now that they never dosed for it before because it's been that wet. So once you see wet conditions, you're going to end up with liver fluke generally on a farm. So you might say, well, I dosed for liver fluke early on with maybe some sort of a dose, but I'm not sure will it cover me. So I suppose it's similar to using a wormer. Your liver fluke will control a different liver fluke fluke side will control a different stage of fluke. So it's very important when you are buying a liver fluke product that it actually controls the one you want to target. So if you're looking at albendazole or chloroson based product, they're generally controlling an adult liver fluke stage. So about the weeks from 2 to 9 of a liver fluke's life cycle, they aren't covering them. So if you are going with the likes of a triclobendazole product, that's like, for example, an Indofluke product or something like that, where it covers all stages of fluke, then that will cover for every stage of fluke. And then you can go again it'll cover you for nearly 12 weeks then. But you need to keep watching what product you are using and depending on the liver fluke burden you have on the farm. So if you're on quite a wet farm, you could end up dosing twice or maybe 3 times, depending on how the spring will go this year. So like I said there, if you're looking at this spring to summer, you're looking to remove an adult fluke burden. In the autumn, you're looking at preventing an immature fluke migration onto adult fluke. And then in winter, you're looking to remove adult and immature liver fluke. And that's just to prevent liver damage. And if you are targeting fluke, it's just something to be mindful of is to be careful of combination products. So a lot of the albendazole products are for dosing for worms as well. Now, generally, if your adult ewes have not been seen to be, showing signs of having a worm burden, you shouldn't really be dosing mature ewes for worms. But I suppose there's been instances where farmers have fecal egg sampled ewes and has come back that there has been Barber's pole worm in their flocks, then they had to dose with a wormer during the year. And that's, down to, I suppose, when farmers are testing, it only really shows up worms and adult liver fluke problems. You'll never really see a liver fluke outbreak on a fecal egg sample. And the best way, if you want to know if you have a fluke problem on your farm, is if you're killing lambs or maybe killing, we'll say, ewes that are empty now. We'll say this after scanning, we'll say if you are killing ewes, then if you got the slaughter report from them from the factory to say whether or not they had a fluke burden on their in your flock, and that's how you'll know if you have a fluke problem. So in summary, I suppose, like I said, and I know Damian said it as well, but it's being prepared, having all the items to hand when the ewes start lambing down, and it's having adequate lambing pins. So maybe one per 8 ewes in the flock. But if you do have quite a tight lambing period, you might need to have a lot more lambing pins for the amount of ewes you have. And like I said, I've it in red there, using plenty of lime and straw. That's to make sure everything's quite hygienic. And setting up the 3-bucket system for washing and cleaning utensils. Put a plan in place to ensure that each lamb gets adequate colostrum. And I know I didn't mention it earlier on, but try as best you can to give them the ewes colostrum, because generally the antibodies that are in a ewes colostrum are the best, they're the gold standard. And if a ewe doesn't have enough colostrum, you can use the replacement, but I would mix it in with the ewes colostrum to ensure that each lamb is getting some form of its ewes colostrum as best you can. And I suppose that the final one there is having a full flock health plan will reduce the number of issues that can arise at lambing time. And I suppose just to touch on the important dates for the diary for sheep farmers there, submitting a sheep census is, that has to be done. If it's not done already, it should be done as quick as you can. So that has to be done for each year of the sheep improvement scheme. So online this year, the deadline is 14th of February. They are accepting paper applications up until the 31st of January this year. But if you can at all, do it on the 14th of February, before the 14th of February online. Just makes processing easier for the department. And fertilizer dates for Zone B farmers, the slurry and the farmyard manure can be spread from the 16th of January. So that's today. But again, looking at the forecast the weekend, it doesn't look quite well for the weekend. So, if you can at all, hold off on the slurry until weather conditions improve, because there is a lot of rainfall promised for this weekend. Chemical fertilizer then can be spread from the 29th of January. And again, like I said, only spread when conditions allow. And then finally, then the 2024 Teagasc National Sheep Conference will be on Tuesday, the 23rd of January in the Athlone Springs Hotel in Athlone, and as well on Thursday, the 25th of January at 7 p.m. in the Clannery Hotel in Letterkenny. So that's...
Thanks very much, John, for that.
Thanks for listening. No, thank you very
much. And I'll just get you to stop sharing there for a minute, and we'll just be just get you. That's great, John. And indeed, at this stage, I'm now going to hand over to Regional Manager Vivian Silk here, who is going to put our panelists there to the questions there that have been sent in by our viewers tonight. So, good evening to you, Vivian.
Thanks, Brendan, and thanks to John and Damian for their good presentations. John, just while you have the mic there before you switch off completely, there's a question there from a viewer that just joined in late when you were talking about the intraperitoneal injection. Can you just go over that again, and maybe if you want to pull up the slide, you can, or just maybe verbally talk through it?
Yeah, so the way that works is if you have your 20% dextrose solution, you hold up the lamb upright. So the way it is, you have a needle, and you go 1 inch across from the navel, and you go 1 inch down, and you point the needle in at 45 degrees, and you can inject downwards into the abdomen, and that's how the dextrose solution gets into the lamb. So it literally like warms up the lamb and gets them going. So it is quite straightforward. Now, if a farmer is unsure about doing it, they should ask the vet first to show them the right way to do it if they are unsure from even what I'm saying, because it's hard to say it as I'm saying it, like across like that. You nearly want a lamb in front of you to show someone how to do it.
I suppose, John, if things are very bad, it's worth a shot.
It is worth a shot, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. Just Damian, a couple of questions for yourself there that have come through. In terms of it's a general enough question, but maybe you'll be able to answer it. How often should you dose a 4-year-old ewes for worms and fluke? This viewer did them in mid-October when he was letting out the ram, and at that stage, the fluke and worm test came back positive.
Yeah. Um, I think John mentioned it there earlier on, Vivian. We would be saying for adult Joes that are healthy and in good condition, they will build up immunity to stomach worms. From once they're a year and a half or 2 year old, they've built up immunity. So, in terms of the worm side of things, there's really no need to be treating adult Joes for worms. And really, why we're saying that, I suppose, is just from the point of view of anthelmintic resistance, that you're limiting the number of treatments of worms on the farm, and you're keeping a population of untreated sheep. It is a very positive thing, and there's no performance benefit from it if they're if they're otherwise healthy, I suppose. Um, Again, based on the department, as John outlined, the department forecast, this has been a particularly challenging year for fluke. And I think he hit the nail on the head when he said, oftentimes it's maybe more not selecting the correct product or the correct active ingredient in terms of treating fluke. So if you're treating with a product that only controls adult fluke early in the season, we'll say, as he mentioned, October, there's probably little or no adult fluke there at the time. Ideally, and as he mentioned, the triclopyrazole products as well documented resistance issues, I suppose, on certain farms. They've stopped working over the years, but let's assume they work. You might be starting with something like a triclopyrazole product in October, and depending on it's very farm specific after that. Um, you could be coming back 6 to 8 weeks later if it's a very high risk fluke farm with another treatment. Again, if they're housed for a period, it kind of helps to break the cycle as well. That if you can, if they're housed for a month or 6 weeks, if you treat at that stage with something like the Clazental or the Rifoxanate based products, you're taking out everything that's kind of, they haven't picked up anything obviously from once they go into the shed. So it's very farm specific, Vivian. But
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, just to Damien, another question for you there, and you kind of mentioned it in your presentation, and I think the question is based on when should you start feeding nuts for ewes on good grass if they're carrying carrying 2 lambs each. So we'll say take mid-March, they're on good grass at the minute. When
Yeah.
should you start to introduce the meal? I suppose you mentioned it in your talk, body condition and so on.
Yeah, it's yeah, exactly. I suppose, look, you could sort of probably assume that if it's very good quality grass, that it's similar to really high quality silage. I'm talking in the high 70s DMD. So you could possibly delay the start of feeding until for twin bearing ewes, probably maybe 5 to 6 weeks out from lambing. But again, the same principles apply in terms of stepping it up gradually. And if you are feeding over a half a kilo, that you split it twice a day. That's easier said than done. I fully understand that from an outwintered sheep point of view, that you're going out in the field feeding a group of ewes. But again, as you said yourself there, if they're in very good body condition, the big challenge probably will be in the last 2 or 3 weeks, when probably they need a good protein source getting into them, to ensure that they've good quality colostrum and plenty of it. The other challenge, I suppose, we see with feeding ewes outdoors is the chances of them being split into a group of singles, twins, and triplets are much less than in a situation where you have them housed. But look at it, as I say, you'd be basing it, if the quality of the grass is really good, you'd be basing it on a sample feeding plan similar to really high quality silage. I didn't put up one there, but it'd be less, good quality grass. It'd be better than the 70 DMD silage example I gave there earlier on.
Yeah. Okay. So that'd be real green grass even at the minute, and it'd be
Yeah,
good
it wants
and
to be
lush. Yeah.
good quality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It wouldn't want to be preserved for too awfully long. Just
Yeah.
switching back to John again, and both you mentioned straw in your presentations, and the prices of it at the minute would actually frighten you. I heard a few prices during the week. So John, a question for you. Straw is very hard to come by. Is there any alternatives that can be used if you either cannot get straw or it's wildly expensive at the minute?
Yeah, so there is alternatives. I have seen guys bedding with maybe likes of hay or even rushes or that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, and even trying to better wood chip, again, wood chip hard to get rid of then once it's used. And to be honest, I wouldn't like it in terms of lambing down on, lambing the O's actually down on it. It's not that hygienic either. And at the end of the day, you won't beat straw in terms of the soaking ability of it and the hygiene element of it. And especially if you are putting newborn lambs into those, we'll say the 5 foot by 5 foot pins, you really need to be using straw for them and use a decent bit of lime as well on it. You really can't really look past it. I know it's dear. This year and of all years, it is quite dear. And I have heard some of the prices that people have to pay for it, unfortunately. But at the end of the day, you have to look at it this way: is if it does save a few lambs by using it accordingly and as best you can, then it might keep the vet away, as they say, for a while.
Okay.
Yeah.
If I could just add to that, Vivian, for 1 second,
Yes,
John is
yes,
absolutely
Damian,
right there. There was work done on different bedding materials in the UK a few years ago, and cleanliness seemed to be the biggest issue with it. And John is absolutely right. You kind of really won't replace straw. There were some situations where people may be using a combination of, something like sawdust or wood chip or something. But again, as John said, it'll be very slow to break down then after that. But there'll be a certain amount of straw needed anyways. So but it's hard to replace it.
Okay, and another question, maybe Damien, you want to handle this one? A little bit later lambing than we'd be used to, but would you recommend lambing twin ewes outside if they're going to lamb in April, and what's the pros and cons of that in terms of outside lambing and supervision and maybe other issues?
Yeah, look, there's people doing it. There's people doing it very successfully. There's a number of factors at play. Again, I suppose there's even in April, there's probably still no guarantee of the weather, and the drawbacks are kind of predators like foxes and things like that. But on the flip side of that, I suppose some people who maybe were finding hygiene and that's very challenging in a housing situation have maybe found that outdoor lambing was helped them in that situation. So look, there's pros and cons to wood. Again, your type, you'd obviously need a EO that would have very good mothering ability and would be a good hard EO and a good mother. But look, there are people that are doing it very successfully. And again, as they're probably right in pushing the lambing date out into April, that you have slightly longer days, and there are, I suppose, a higher chance of reasonably good weather conditions. But as I say, yeah, look, it can be done.
Yeah.
It can be done. Yeah.
Okay, and you need good grass, I suppose, outside.
Yeah, ideally. I mean, what a lot of people do, what a lot of people that do it successfully, I suppose, have kind of closed up a bit like what we talk about. They've closed up. These fields maybe since last October, and there is a nice bit of spring grass there, and they're only just turning them into that then maybe in the week or two running up to lambing, so that they're maybe dividing them into suitable size groups or that.
Okay,
And
okay,
or else
okay.
they're putting them all in a fairly big group and moving them into the type of paddocks you describe after lambing then.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. Just a question came in early. It's not totally related to sheep, but I see it as it came in quite early. We'll ask it. John, I think you're going to handle this one. Do you know if the Department of Agriculture has set specifications for the acres, bat boxes, swallow boxes, or swift boxes? I think you have the answer to that one.
Yeah, they have actually, yeah. So that's for the NPIs, is it? Yeah. So yeah, they have. It's actually on the department's website. There's an appendix there on how to actually make them as per department spec. If a farmer wants to make them themselves, they can do that. It's there, but they just have to make them as per spec there.
So just go on the website and the specs are there, John. Yeah. Okay.
It's there, yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much, listeners and viewers, for the questions, and I'll hand back to Brendan just to finish out this evening.
Thanks very much there, Vivian. So we're just about out of time this evening. I'd like to thank our two panelists here this evening, Damian and John, tonight, for their help with the webinar, and indeed thanks to Vivian there for facilitating the questions and answers here tonight. And most importantly, indeed, thanks to you at home for tuning in and for engaging with us here tonight. We hope you found this webinar beneficial, and we'll get the recording uploaded there to the Teagasc Mayo YouTube channel in the coming days. So keep an eye out for that. Just before we finish up, just to remind people again that the Teagasc National Lowland Sheep Conferences take place next week in the Lone Springs Hotel on Tuesday evening, the 23rd at 7 p.m. and the Clannery Hotel in Letterkenny on Thursday evening next, the 25th of January, also starting at 7 p.m. So indeed, all are welcome to attend these conferences, and further details there are available on the Teagasc website. All that's left for me to say is that we'll be back here again next week for episode 3 of the series, where we'll be looking at farm succession, and we will have a speaker from Citizens Information Service talking to us about the Fair Deal scheme, which is operated by the HSE, along with James McDonald from Teagasc, who will be talking to us about how to start the succession process on your farm. So that's all happening next week at the same time. And with that, it's good night from us all here in Teagasc Mayo, and we'll see you all again next Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. Thanks very much, folks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night now, folks.